Over the years, my friends and I explored countless trails and camped in some pretty remote places. But there's one trip we took that none of us will ever forget, a weekend in a cabin deep in the woods that we found through some obscure online listing. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, a chance to disconnect from the world and enjoy nature. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts us to this day. The plan was simple: drive out to this old cabin we rented for next to nothing, spend the weekend hiking, cooking over a campfire, and maybe telling a few ghost stories around the fire. The listing had described the cabin as rustic and secluded, which was exactly what we were looking for, a place to escape the grind of our daily lives. We set out early on Friday, the five of us crammed into Aaron's old SUV, laughing and joking as we drove deeper into the countryside. The road wound through small towns and farmlands, then narrowed as we entered the woods, the trees closing in around us like a tunnel. The farther we went, the fewer signs of civilization we saw. No houses, no power lines, just miles of dense forest. The GPS struggled to keep up, the signal fading out as we ventured further off the beaten path. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was an old, weathered structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dark, and the whole place had an air of abandonment, like it hadn't seen visitors in years. I remember feeling a shiver run down my spine as I stepped out of the car, though I quickly brushed it off as just a reaction to the sudden drop in temperature. "Looks cozy," Aaron joked, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We all laughed, but it was a nervous kind of laughter, the kind you use to cover up unease. There was something about the cabin that felt off, but none of us wanted to be the one to back out. So we grabbed our bags and headed inside. The interior was just as run down as the outside: dusty furniture, creaky floorboards, and a musty smell that hung in the air. The kitchen was small, with outdated appliances and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The living room had a few old, mismatched chairs and a threadbare couch, all facing a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. A wooden staircase led up to a loft where there were a couple of small bedrooms. As we unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding, like we weren't supposed to be there. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making every little noise seem louder than it should be. But I didn't say anything, chalking it up to nerves and the unfamiliar setting. We spent the first evening trying to get settled in. Aaron and I got a fire going in the fireplace, while the others unpacked and set up the kitchen. We made hot dogs and beans for dinner, the kind of meal that tastes better when you're out in the woods. We ate around the fireplace, the crackling flames the only sound in the cabin. The conversation was light, but there was an underlying tension that none of us wanted to acknowledge. After dinner, we decided to explore the area around the cabin before it got too dark. The woods were dense and overgrown, the trees tall and close together, blocking out most of the remaining light. We wandered around for a while, talking about how we should go hiking the next day, maybe even try to find a stream we could fish in. But as we moved deeper into the woods, that feeling of unease started to creep back in. The trees seemed to press in on us, the shadows growing longer and darker with every step. Eventually, we stumbled upon a small clearing where we found something that made us all stop in our tracks: a cluster of old gravestones, half buried in the earth, their inscriptions worn away by time. There were no signs of any buildings or paths nearby, just these forgotten graves in the middle of the woods. It was unsettling, to say the least, but we tried to laugh it off. "Guess we know why the cabin was so cheap," Sarah said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing like a graveyard to keep the rent low." We didn't stay long after that. The sun had set, and the darkness was closing in fast. We made our way back to the cabin, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to follow us through the trees. Back at the cabin, we tried to shake off the unease by playing cards and telling stories, but the atmosphere had changed. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the old furniture look even more decrepit. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made us jumpy, our nerves on edge. It felt like the cabin was watching us. At some point, we heard it, a faint noise coming from outside, like someone or something was moving around the cabin. It was a soft shuffling sound, almost like footsteps on the dirt. We all froze, the cards forgotten, our eyes darting to the windows. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark nodded, his face pale in the firelight. "Yeah, maybe it's just an animal." None of us believed that. The sound was too deliberate, too slow to be an animal. It circled the cabin, pausing every so often, then continuing. The silence inside was suffocating, broken only by the crackling of the fire. "Maybe we should check it out," Mike suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "No way," Sarah shot back. "We should stay inside. Whatever it is, it'll go away." But the sound didn't go away. It continued, methodically circling the cabin, getting more distinct. It was as if whoever or whatever was outside wanted us to know it was there, wanted us to be afraid. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up. "I'm going to see what it is," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Aaron joined me, and together we approached the front door. The others stayed by the fireplace, their faces tense with fear. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, the only sound the relentless footsteps outside. We opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The cold night air hit us like a wall, and the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. I shone the flashlight around, the beam sweeping across the trees, the porch, the dirt path leading to the woods. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. Mark and I exchanged a nervous glance, then stepped outside, the gravel crunching under our feet. The sound had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving. We walked around the cabin, the flashlight casting long, eerie shadows, but there was nothing there, no footprints, no signs of disturbance, just the endless darkness of the woods. We went back inside, trying to convince ourselves that it was nothing, just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But deep down, we knew something was wrong. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, the air thick with an unspoken fear. We sat by the fire for a while longer, trying to act normal, but the tension was unbearable. Eventually, we decided to call it a night, hoping that sleep would take away the unease. We all agreed to sleep in the living room, not wanting to be alone in the small, dark bedrooms upstairs. We set up our sleeping bags around the fireplace, the flickering flames providing the only light in the room, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. Every little noise made my heart race, my mind conjuring images of shadows moving just beyond the firelight. I could tell the others were awake too, their breathing quick and shallow, their bodies tense. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, this time coming from above us in the loft. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the wooden floor above us. My heart stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I glanced at Aaron, who was wide-eyed, staring up at the ceiling. "Someone's up there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't respond, too terrified to speak. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, as if whoever was up there was searching for something. The floorboards creaked under the weight, the sound loud in the silence of the night. We were paralyzed with fear, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The footsteps moved to the top of the stairs, then stopped for a moment. There was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and our own panicked breathing. Then, slowly, the footsteps began to descend the stairs. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. "We need to leave now," I said, my voice shaking. The others didn't need convincing. We scrambled to gather our things, our movements frantic and uncoordinated. The footsteps continued down the stairs, growing closer with every second. We didn't wait to see who or what was coming. We bolted for the door, bursting out into the cold night air. We ran to the car, not daring to look back. Aaron fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, but finally managed to get the door open. We piled in, slamming the doors behind us. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the gravel path, the cabin disappearing into the darkness behind us. We didn't stop until we were miles away. No one spoke, the fear still fresh in our minds. It wasn't until we reached the main road that Aaron finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my heart still pounding. "But I'm not going back to find out." None of us slept that night. We found a cheap motel in the nearest town and huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there were no answers, only the lingering fear and the memory of those footsteps coming down the stairs. There's something about being out on the water that's both calming and unnerving. The vast expanse of a lake, the isolation, the way sound carries across the still surface. It's the kind of place where you can feel both completely free and utterly exposed. I love fishing, especially on remote lakes where it feels like the rest of the world doesn't exist. But after what happened on that lake a few summers ago, I can't shake the feeling that some places are better left alone. It was at the tail end of summer, and my friend Mark and I decided to take a trip up to a lake we'd heard about from a couple of locals in the nearby town. It wasn't on any map, just a secluded spot deep in the woods, the kind of place where you wouldn't find another soul for miles. The locals had described it as a fisherman's paradise: clear waters, plenty of fish, and best of all, total seclusion. The drive up there was long and winding, the kind of road that twists and turns through dense forests, where the trees arch over you like a tunnel. The sun was setting as we finally reached the lake, casting everything in a warm golden glow. The lake was even more beautiful than I'd imagined, crystal clear, with the last rays of sunlight sparkling on the surface. The water was so calm, it looked like glass, reflecting the trees and the sky perfectly. We set up camp on a small clearing by the shore, our tent facing the water. There was a slight chill in the air, the first hint that summer was coming to an end. But the sky was clear, and the stars were already beginning to appear. It was the kind of night that made you feel glad to be alive, to be out in nature, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. After setting up camp, we decided to get in a bit of fishing before it got too dark. We pushed our small aluminum boat into the water, the soft splash of the oars breaking the silence. The lake was eerily quiet, no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water lapping gently against the sides of the boat. It was peaceful, but there was something almost unsettling about the silence, like the whole world was holding its breath. We rowed out to the middle of the lake where the water was deep and dark. The sun had fully set by then, and the only light came from the sliver of a moon hanging low in the sky and the faint glow of our lantern. We cast our lines, sitting in companionable silence, waiting for a bite. That's when we noticed him. At first, it was just a shadow on the shore, barely visible in the fading light. I thought it might have been a trick of the light, or maybe an animal moving through the trees. But then, as I looked closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing on the shore, motionless, just watching us. "Hey, Mark," I whispered, trying not to sound alarmed. You see that guy over there? Mark turned to look, squinting into the darkness. Yeah, I see him. Weird. You think he's just another camper? I don't know, I replied, my voice low, but I thought we were the only ones out here. Mark shrugged, trying to brush it off. Maybe he's just a local, checking out who's on his lake. We tried to ignore the man and focus on our fishing, but it was hard not to feel uneasy. Every time I glanced over at the shore, he was still there, standing perfectly still, just watching. He wasn't holding any fishing gear, no flashlight, nothing, just standing there in the dark. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. This is starting to creep me out, I said, my voice shaking slightly. Why is he just standing there? Mark nodded, his expression serious now. Yeah, it's weird. Maybe we should head back to camp. I didn't argue. We reeled in our lines, and I grabbed the oars, rowing us back to the shore. The whole time, I kept my eyes on the man, but he didn't move. He just kept watching us, his figure barely visible in the shadows. We reached the shore and quickly dragged the boat onto the bank. The man was still there, but now that we were closer, I could see him a little better. He was tall and thin, with long, unkempt hair and clothes that looked dirty and ragged. But what struck me most was his face. It was blank, emotionless, like he was in a trance. Mark and I exchanged a nervous glance, both of us thinking the same thing. This guy wasn't just another camper. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Let's just get back to the tent, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We started walking back to our campsite, our footsteps quickening as we moved away from the lake. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting the man to be following us, but he was still there on the shore watching us leave. We made it back to the tent, our nerves on edge. The fire we built earlier had burned down to embers, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. We didn't say much as we sat down, both of us too spooked to talk about what had just happened. The silence of the night seemed to press in on us, the only sound the occasional crackle of the dying fire. I couldn't shake the image of the man's face from my mind, the blank stare, the way he just stood there, unmoving. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that he was just some strange local, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. We should have just asked him what he was doing, Mark said after a long silence, his voice strained. Maybe he's harmless, just weird. Maybe, I replied, though I didn't believe it. But what if he's not? We both knew the answer to that question. The isolation, the darkness, the fact that we were miles from the nearest town, it all added up to a feeling of vulnerability I'd never experienced before. We were alone out here, and if something went wrong, there was no one to help us. We tried to distract ourselves by cooking a quick dinner over the fire, but the tension in the air was palpable, our eyes darting to the darkness beyond the firelight. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After dinner, we decided to turn in for the night, hoping that sleep would take the edge off our nerves. But as I lay there in the tent, staring up at the canvas ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending shivers down my spine. I listened intently, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. But all I could hear was the wind and the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A soft rhythmic sound like something gently tapping against the side of the tent. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, listening, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind. But the sound came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I reached over and shook Mark awake, my hand trembling. Mark, wake up. Do you hear that? Mark groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. Hear what? Before I could answer, the tapping came again, this time more insistent. We both froze, our eyes wide with fear. It was coming from the side of the tent, right next to where we were sleeping. Who's out there? Mark called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, just the wind and the faint rustle of leaves. Then, after a moment of silence, the tapping stopped. We sat there in the dark, holding our breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the only sound was the wind. After what felt like an eternity, Mark grabbed the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, peeking outside. There was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the breeze and the faint glow of the moon on the lake. But as Mark shone the flashlight around the campsite, he caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, fresh footprints, leading from the shore to the side of our tent and then back to the lake. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. Someone had been outside our tent watching us while we slept. We scrambled out of the tent, our fear driving us to pack up as quickly as possible. The thought of staying there, even for another minute, was unbearable. As we hastily packed our gear, I kept glancing toward the lake, half expecting to see the man standing there again. But the shoreline was empty, the water still and silent. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. We didn't speak much as we packed up. Our movements were quick, driven by the overwhelming need to get out of there. The once serene and beautiful lake now felt like a place of danger, a place we needed to escape from as fast as possible. The drive back to town was tense, the silence in the truck heavy with fear. The road wound through the forest, the trees casting long, dark shadows in the moonlight. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following us. But the road remained empty. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway, the lights of the town just visible in the distance, that I finally started to relax. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but the fear lingered, a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. We never talked about that night again. We both knew that whatever had happened on that lake, it wasn't something we wanted to relive, but the memory of that night has stayed with me to this day. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I don't know why he was watching us or why he followed us to our tent, but the fear I felt that night, the feeling of being watched, is something I'll never forget. And though I've tried to put it behind me, the memory of that man and the sight of those fresh footprints outside our tent still haunts me. Because sometimes, in the middle of nowhere, you're not as alone as you think.
I've been a land surveyor for nearly 2 decades now, and I've worked in some pretty remote areas. I've seen it all: wild animals, unpredictable weather, and equipment failures miles from civilization, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered under that bridge in the Arizona desert. It's the kind of experience that sticks with you, gnawing at the edges of your mind, reminding you that out there in the middle of nowhere, you're truly on your own. It was mid-July, the kind of day where the heat presses down on you like a weight, and the sun seems determined to burn everything to a crisp. The Arizona desert stretched out in every direction, an endless sea of sand, rocks, and scrub brush, with nothing but the occasional cactus to break the monotony. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the kind of blue that seems to go on forever. I was assigned to survey a bridge that spanned a dry riverbed, about 50 miles outside of Phoenix. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was straightforward enough. Check the structural integrity, measure the wear and tear, and make sure it was still up to code. The bridge itself was old, probably built back in the 60s and hadn't seen much traffic in recent years. It was isolated, far from any town or main road, which made it perfect for someone like me who preferred working alone. I drove my truck down a dusty, narrow road that wound its way through the desert, the tires kicking up clouds of red dust in my wake. The radio crackled with static, the signal fading in and out. As I got farther from civilization, I didn't mind the quiet, though. In fact, I relished it. Out here, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. I reached the bridge around midday, the sun high in the sky, baking the earth below. I parked my truck on the side of the road, grabbed my gear, and started the routine inspection. The bridge looked worse for wear. Rusted metal beams, cracks in the concrete, and a layer of dust and grime that hadn't been disturbed in years. As I moved under the bridge to check the supports, I noticed something unusual. A large dumpster tucked away in the shadows beneath the structure. It was an odd sight, completely out of place in the middle of the desert. I couldn't imagine why anyone would leave a dumpster out here, especially in such a remote location. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The dumpster was old and battered, covered in rust and graffiti. There was a faint, unpleasant odor coming from it, like something had been rotting inside for a long time. I hesitated for a moment, then carefully lifted the lid, half expecting to find nothing but old trash. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. Inside the dumpster were piles of tattered clothes, dirty blankets, and what looked like empty food containers. It was clear someone had been living here, using the dumpster as a makeshift shelter. But there was something else, something that sent a shiver down my spine. Among the debris were strange, crude drawings scratched into the metal walls. They depicted distorted faces, twisted bodies, and symbols I didn't recognize. My first thought was that some drifter had taken up residence here, someone down on their luck, using this desolate spot as a place to hide from the world. It wasn't unusual to come across homeless camps in remote areas, but this felt different. More desperate, more unhinged. I backed away from the dumpster, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd seen enough. I just wanted to finish my inspection and get out of there. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me, focusing on the task at hand. But as I worked, I couldn't help but glance back at the dumpster, half expecting to see someone emerging from the shadows. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from the bridge to the surrounding desert, but I didn't see anyone. The sound stopped, and for a moment there was only the wind whistling through the dry riverbed. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from behind the dumpster, a man, his clothes filthy and tattered, his hair wild and matted. He was tall, gaunt, with a crazed look in his eyes. He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable, then began to move toward me. My heart leapt into my throat. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but I knew I didn't want to stick around to find out. I quickly backed away, trying to keep some distance between us, but he kept coming, his pace quickening with every step. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'm just doing my job here. I'll be out of your way in a minute." But he didn't respond. His eyes were locked on me, and there was something in his gaze that sent a wave of fear crashing over me, something wild, unhinged, like he was barely holding on to reality. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. My truck was parked a few yards away, but the man was between me and it. I didn't want to turn my back on him, but I knew I couldn't stay here. The survey, the job, none of that mattered anymore. All I cared about was getting out of there in one piece. Then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "This is my place," he said, his words slurred and broken. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my tone as calm as I could. "I didn't know. I'll leave right now, okay?" But he didn't stop. He kept coming, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, his eyes wild with some emotion I couldn't read. I took another step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The distance between us was closing fast, and I knew I had to act without thinking. I reached for the revolver I kept holstered at my side, a precaution I always took when working in remote areas. My hand shook as I pulled it out and aimed it at the man, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Don't come any closer." The man froze, his eyes widening as he saw the gun. For a moment, I thought he might back down, that he might realize the situation had gone too far, but then he did something I didn't expect. He smiled, a twisted, eerie grin that sent chills down my spine. "You think that's gonna help you?" he sneered, taking another step forward. "Out here, you're just as alone as I am." I didn't wait to find out what he meant by that. I fired a warning shot into the ground at his feet, the sound echoing through the empty desert. The man flinched, but he didn't stop. He kept coming, his smile widening, his eyes gleaming with some dark intent. Panic surged through me. I knew I couldn't take my eyes off him, but I also knew I couldn't stay here. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and made a break for it. I sprinted toward my truck, not daring to look back, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands fumbled with the keys, but I finally managed to start the engine. As I slammed the door shut, I caught one last glimpse of the man standing by the dumpster, watching me with that same eerie smile. I floored the gas pedal and sped down the dusty road, the tires kicking up clouds of sand behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away. The bridge, nothing but a distant memory in the rearview mirror. I never went back to that site. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who sent someone else to finish the job. I don't know what happened to the man under the bridge, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I came too close to something dark, something that could have ended very differently. Even now, I still think about that day. I still see the man's face, that twisted smile in my nightmares, and every time I find myself in a remote area, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there waiting, watching. The experience under that bridge taught me a lesson I'll never forget. When you're alone in the middle of nowhere, you're vulnerable in ways you can't imagine. The isolation, the emptiness, it plays tricks on your mind, makes you question what's real and what isn't, and sometimes you encounter things that remind you just how thin the line between safety and danger really is. So if you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere, remember this story, stay aware, stay cautious, and most importantly, stay safe, because out there you're on your own and you never know what might be lurking just out of sight. I've stayed in all kinds of motels over the years, from the cozy and charming to the rundown and questionable, but there's one motel that I stayed at a few years ago that I'll never forget. It was a small, isolated place off a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. I didn't plan on stopping there, but after driving for hours with no sign of civilization, I didn't have much choice. I just needed a place to rest for the night. What I found instead was a nightmare that still haunts me. I'd been driving for hours trying to make it to the next town before calling it a night, but the road seemed to stretch on forever, winding through miles of empty fields and forest. The headlights of my car barely cut through the blackness, the occasional signpost or abandoned barn, the only indication that I was still on the right path. When I finally saw the flickering neon sign for the motel, I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't much. A small single-story building with a handful of rooms, a few old cars parked out front, and a faded sign that read vacancy in dim, sputtering letters. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, the paint peeling off the walls, the windows grimy and cracked, but I was too tired to care. I just needed a place to sleep, somewhere to rest my head before continuing my journey in the morning. I pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching under the car as I parked. The air was cold, the sky overcast, and a faint mist hung in the air, clinging to everything like a damp shroud. The only light came from the neon sign and a single bulb above the motel's entrance, casting an eerie yellow glow on the worn-out pavement. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The door creaked on its hinges as I pushed it open. The lobby was small and dingy, with faded wallpaper and a few outdated brochures scattered on a dusty counter. Behind the counter sat an old man, his eyes barely visible behind thick, smudged glasses. He looked up as I entered, his expression blank, almost indifferent. Need a room? I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The old man didn't say anything at first, just stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. He reached under the counter and pulled out a worn leather-bound ledger, flipping it open to a blank page. His hands shook slightly as he handed me a pen. "Sign here," he muttered, his voice gravelly and low. I scribbled my name in the ledger and handed it back to him. He didn't even glance at it, just shoved it aside and reached for a key hanging on a hook behind the counter. "Room 6, he said, sliding the key across the counter. "Smoking? No pets?" "Got it," I replied, taking the key. "Thanks." He didn't respond, just stared at me with that same blank expression. As I turned and headed back outside, room 6 was at the far end of the building, next to a thick line of trees that bordered the property. The door was old and chipped, the number barely visible, but the key turned easily enough in the lock. The room inside was about what I expected, small with a sagging bed, a rickety dresser, and a tiny TV mounted on the wall. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper peeling, and the whole place smelled faintly of mildew. But it was warm, and after the long drive, it was enough. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, the mattress creaking under my weight. I grabbed the remote and flicked on the TV, but all I got was static. Sighing, I turned it off and glanced around the room, noticing a small door to the side that I assumed led to the bathroom. I walked over and pushed it open, revealing a cramped, outdated bathroom with a cracked mirror and a flickering overhead light. After freshening up, I changed into some sweats and crawled into bed, pulling the thin blankets up to my chin. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the highway. I turned off the lamp beside the bed and closed my eyes, trying to let the exhaustion of the day take over. But sleep didn't come easily. The darkness felt oppressive, the silence too complete, as if the world outside the room had ceased to exist. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at the back of my mind. Something about the motel, about the old man behind the counter, about the whole place felt wrong. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from outside the room. It was a faint noise, like something gently tapping against the door. My heart skipped a beat and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch from one of the nearby trees, brushing against the door. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady. It wasn't random. It was intentional. I felt a chill run down my spine and my hands shook as I reached for the lamp. The light flickered on. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound still echoing in my ears. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to see what was causing the noise, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I did. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cold floor. I crept toward the door, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but I didn't. I reached the door and placed my hand on the cold doorknob, hesitating for just a moment before turning it and pulling the door open. The night air rushed in, cold and damp, but there was nothing there. Just the empty parking lot, the gravel gleaming faintly in the light of the distant neon sign. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching under my feet, and looked around. The mist hung low to the ground, making everything look ghostly, unreal. There was no one there, no sign of anything or anyone that could have made the sound. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it really was just the wind, or maybe I was more tired than I realized. I was about to turn back to the room when I noticed something, a single footprint in the gravel, just a few feet from the door. It wasn't mine. The print was large, the outline clear in the mist-covered gravel, and it led away from the room, disappearing into the line of trees at the edge of the property. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly retreated back into the room, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I pressed my back against the door, my mind racing. Someone had been out there, standing just outside my room, but where had they gone? And why were they just standing there tapping on the door? I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just some weirdo messing around, maybe one of the other guests playing a prank, But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something off about the whole situation, something that made my skin crawl. I crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin, but there was no way I was going to sleep now. I lay there in the dark, staring at the door. The hours seemed to stretch on forever. The silence in the room, it was suffocating. And just as I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it again. This time it was coming from the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The window was right next to the bed, covered by a thin curtain that barely blocked out the light. The sound was soft, almost like someone gently tapping on the glass with their fingernails. I didn't want to look, I didn't want to see what was out there, but the sound continued, persistent, rhythmic, like it was trying to draw me closer, trying to get me to look. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blankets over my head, like a child hiding from a monster under the bed. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination, that if I stayed still, stayed quiet, it would go away. But the tapping didn't stop. The room felt like a prison, the walls closing in around me. I was trapped. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I couldn't just lie there and do nothing. With a trembling hand, I reached out and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. I took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to look, to see what was outside the window. I slowly pulled the blankets down, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. I shone the flashlight at the window, the beam casting a faint glow on the thin curtain. I could see a vague shape behind it, something standing just outside the glass, barely visible. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out with my free hand, gripping the edge of the curtain. I hesitated for just a moment, then yanked it aside. The flashlight beam illuminated the window. There was nothing there. No figure, no face, no sign of anything that could have been making the noise. Just the empty parking lot, the mist swirling in the faint light of the neon sign. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing. I was about to close the curtain when I noticed something. Something small, barely visible in the corner of the window, a handprint smudged and faint but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The handprint was on the inside of the glass. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back from the window, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. I grabbed my keys, my bag, anything I could reach, and bolted for the door. I didn't care about checking out, didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. I fumbled with the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob. Finally, I managed to wrench it open and ran out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was in the car, the engine roaring to life as I tore out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind me. I drove for hours, the lights of civilization finally bringing some semblance of safety. I found a motel there, one that was clean and well lit, and checked in without a second thought. But even then, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that handprint in my mind, kept hearing that soft, rhythmic tapping. I never found out what happened that night. Never went back to that motel to find out who or what was outside my room. I've told a few people about it, but most just laugh it off, say it was probably just my imagination or some prankster messing with me, but I know what I heard, what I saw, and I know that whatever was out there, it wasn't just my imagination. I've spent a lot of time on the road since then, stayed in a lot of motels, but I always make sure to find a place that's well lit, that's near other people, and I never ever stop at some lonely, isolated place in the middle of nowhere. Because out there, in the darkness, in the silence, there's something waiting, something that will find you if you're not careful, and once it does, you may never escape. If these stories sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Share your own creepy encounters in the comments. I'd love to hear what keeps you up at night, and don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and remember, the scariest places are often where you least expect them. Stay safe out there.